Well, welcome back to our class on Lamentations, the language of Lamentations. And today we'll be looking at chapter 5, verses 1 through 11. And our title for today is See Our Disgrace. And after this lesson, we just have one more. Restore Us to Yourself, verses 12 to 22, which we will look at next week. The main commentaries I've been using are down below. I will actually starting on the very next slide, show you some of the stuff that John Goldengay has concerning chapter 5. I also want to give credit to BibleGateway.com, where I get my passages of scripture, whether it's the Hebrew text, pardon me, the Westminster Leningrad Codex, or the ESV and the New American Standard Bible. So all those coming from BibleGateway.com. I'll also be looking at brief little pieces of the Reader's Hebrew Bible and BHS, which is the standard Hebrew text. And based on the same Leningrad Codex. And when we get there, I'll just show you what I wanted to share with you for today with that. So let's look at a few of the notes for chapter 5. We're going to look at half of them this week and half next week. These are the notes that Goldengay has in his commentary concerning things that are different in chapter 5 as opposed to 1 through 4. And he'll give different clarifications concerning that. He did the similarities as he's done with every chapter, but um, for this class and for the length of time that we have, I'll just look at the differences that he notes. So, Golden Gaze notes on chapter 5 concerning the differences, the ways in which chapter 5 stands out, I guess would be a good way to put it. In incorporating address to Yahweh, an appeal for a hearing, a substantial account of affliction, a low key acknowledgement of wrongdoing, an affirmation of trust, and a plea, it is closer to the form of a protest psalm, specifically a communal protest as opposed to an individual protest, than the other poems. So compared to 1 through 4, this is more closely, would be more easily labeled a protest psalm. If it appeared in the Psalter, it would not look out of place in the company of Psalms 44, 74, 79, and other Psalms with 22 lines, like Psalm 33, 38, and 103. It thus works for its audience by sticking close to a familiar form of prayer rather than by using poetic creativity to construct a new form. Secondly, it comprises only 22 lines. The brevity of the poem, half the length of Lamentations 4, and 1/3 as long as Lamentations 1, 2, and 3. So the brevity of the poem and the abandonment of the acrostic form focuses the attention on the desperate plea contained within. As we've noticed, 1 through 4 were all acrostics from the Hebrew alphabet. So in 1, 2, and 4, verse 1 started with an aleph, verse 2 with a bait, etc. Chapter 3, triple the number of verses. That's because 1, 2, and 3 started with aleph. 4, 5, and 6 started with bait, etc., through the 66 verses. But I'll show you in just a little bit the length of chapter 3, which we talked about already, is no longer than 1 or 2, just happens to be broken up into more parts. All right. Continuing on with Golden Gay here. If the alphabetic structuring of the other poems about the disaster enables them to combine a sense of disorder with a sense of order, a possible effect of placing this poem at the end of the collection is to take a step away from that balance. This poem serves as a summation of the pain of the people, the city, the nation, and a final demand that God pay attention to them. Though to speak of accelerating hopelessness is to read more into it than is evidently there. The hint of a lack of order is counterbalanced by the fact that every line in the poem is a self contained bicolon, that every line apart from verse 16 manifests some parallelism, and that the poem's language is straightforward and manifests less ellipsis. It also lacks any parallelism between lines, except in verses 9 and 10. In addition, the lines do group. Verses 2 to 4 belong together, as do verses 5 through 7 and 8 through 10. On the other hand, the poem uses a distinctive word order in which the verb comes second or third in the sentence rather than first. We've noted a few times this quarter that typically with a Hebrew sentence, the verb is first. And here he says, see especially verses 2, 3, 4a, 4b, 5a, 6, 7a, 7b, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12a, 12b, 13a, 13b, and 14, which is elsewhere usually a mark of emphasis or of the subordination of one clause to another. Surprisingly, the dominant rhythm of the poem is 3-3, the regular rhythm for more upbeat poetry. Only verses 2, 3, 14, and 18 have a two-beat second colon. It is another hint that we are coming to the end of this sequence of poems. We are about to return to the ordinary, familiar world. Whereas other poems intersperse protest with prayer, this poem sets protest in the context of prayer. All right. And then one more note from Golden Gay for this week. No I speaks in this poem, no first person singular. Excuse me. And whereas Lamentations 1 and 2 never spoke in first person plural terms, and 3 and 4 did so only when they were past the halfway point, Lamentations 5 speaks throughout in the first person plural, we, our, us terms, except pretty much right in the middle, except verses 11 to 14, and thus speaks explicitly in identification with and explicitly on behalf of the community. It thus most systematically draws the community into its formulation of prayer and its articulation of loss and anguish. The text of Lamentations did not come about without the real or ideal presence of community, more precisely, of a responsive congregation. Whereas reading the preceding poems might confuse the reader because of the mixed voices presented in the text, and we've noted that sometimes it seems like it's a single person speaking on behalf, and sometimes it's the whole community. Um, in Lamentations 5, in contrast to that, the reader recognizes a plural speech now unifying both the narrator and Jerusalem. So everything comes together in a sense in chapter 5. All right, this is the whole, and don't expect anyone to be able to read this. I had to make it real small to show, but here it shows the whole text of Lamentations, all 5 poems. And you can see that 1, 2, and 3 are pretty much identical. Now, with 3, the verses 1, 2, and 3 are on that first line, then 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because of the way of the structure. But you can see the 3 verses are almost the same length as one verse in chapter 1, 2, and 4. And so we have, I should say 1 and 2. So 1, 2, and 3 are almost identical in length. You can see that 4 is shorter. It's a third shorter. Instead of 3 lines for each verse in 1 and 2, and then of course in 3, the 3 lines being 3 different verses, it's just 2. And then in chapter 5, it's just 1. So chapter 5 is half the length of chapter 4 as far as number of words. And you can see that a little more clearly in the English. So here's the whole English ESV of the Book of Lamentations, and I broke it into the sections that we did. So we spent 2 weeks on chapter 1, 2 weeks on chapter 2, 3 weeks on chapter 3, 2 weeks on chapter 4, and we're in our first week of chapter 5 right now. And you can see how much shorter chapter 5 is than the rest of the book. Hence, a little more of this introductory material. But I thought this was really cool to look at. And I'll just, one of my little things I like to point out every now and then is just the importance of looking at biblical texts as a whole, and particularly with the letters in the New Testament. With Lamentations, these are five separate poems. I mean, these are they all go together. They are a one big work in five sections, but especially in the New Testament with the letters that Paul wrote to the churches. For example, the letter to the Ephesians. I think it's important for us not only to do what we typically do in Bible study, kind of verse by verse and kind of looking at things little by little, but I think it's really important for us occasionally to just read the entire letter or listen to it, even better. I think it's something that we need to make sure we do, because that's how the people in the first century received these things. They did not have copies. They couldn't run over to the copy machine and say, "We got a new letter from Paul. Here's a copy for everybody." No, they just had to listen to it. And so I think it's really important for us to listen to the text of the Bible and see it as a whole. You can actually, on a computer screen, you can actually read this. You might be able to, depending on the size of your screen. As you're watching this video, you could pause and read the whole of the letter all together. Or letter, not letter, but all of this work, the book of Lamentations, all at once, if you so desired. And so I do think that's important for us. All right, well, let's dive into today's text and Lamentations chapter 5. We'll look first at verses 1 and 2. Remember, Lord, what has come upon us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to foreigners. And so here in 5, just already we see more of a plea, more of a prayer, and really kind of a nice thing, um, as opposed to just pointing out all the now, this chapter will point out all the terrible things that are happening, but it is nice to see that there's a plea to the Lord. Um, and of course, in yellow, I try to remember to highlight when the personal name of God is being used, and that is what's being used here. Remember, Lord, what has come upon us. Look and see our disgrace. And I do want us to, and I actually did put it, I typed it into the slide here. So the word there for disgrace, the green word at the bottom as well, it's really the word for reproach. Disgrace is a synonym, so that's great. And so this word, the Hebrew word, means reproach, which rests upon one. So it's a reproach, it's a disgrace that someone is bearing, a condition of shame or disgrace. And then, for example, in the Old Testament, it would include sexual disgrace or shame or reproach, barrenness of womb, widowhood, hunger or disease, ritual or uncircumcision, injuries from enemies. And we did a whole quarter on talking about shame and living without shame. One of the things that is worthy of note for us, shame in the Old Testament context was not necessarily the fault of the person. Obviously, a woman cannot help if she is barren. She cannot help if she's a widow. People cannot help if they are hungry or have a disease. Now, they might be able to help it if they're ritually unclean or uncircumcised, but they also probably can't help it if they have received injuries from enemies. So this reproach, this disgrace, even though from our context it does not look like a lot of these are in someone's control, in the Old Testament mindset, the mindset of the people back then, and Job is a great example of this. It's not a godly point of view, but the way they looked at things, if a woman was barren, or if she was a widow, or if someone was hungry or diseased, or if enemies had defeated someone, that was a sign of God not being with them, to them. Again, not a great point of view or perspective on life, but to them it was a disgrace. And the Bible holds up not as truth, but recognizes that that's how the people viewed this. So they are calling out in verse 1 here to the Lord for him to look and see our disgrace. Being beaten down by an enemy is a disgraceful thing in that culture. And that is what is happening. And they further describe this. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our houses to foreigners. And we'll see more of the terrible things that have happened to them in this sieging of Jerusalem. In the Christian context, we do not have to be disgraced. In fact, in Jesus Christ, we are to stand tall and stand firm. To live is Christ. So 2 Corinthians 4, 1 through 6. Therefore, having this ministry by the mercy of God, we do not lose heart, but we have renounced disgraceful, underhanded ways. We refuse to practice cunning or to tamper with God's word. But by the open statement of the truth, we would commend ourselves to everyone's conscience in the sight of God. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this world has blinded the minds of unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For what we proclaim is not ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, with ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. We're going to look at the rest of this chapter as our final uplifting, positive text for today. So we'll be looking at verses 7 to the end of the chapter in just a little bit. But what an amazing thing to be in Christ. We renounce disgraceful things. We move those aside because of Jesus Christ. We are focused on the light, not on the darkness. All right, continuing in Lamentations 5. So the foreigners have the property, the houses, and then continuing on, we have become orphans without a father. Our mothers are like widows. We have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. Everything is upside down. We should be in charge of this place. We should be the ones charging others for wood and maybe drinking water. But now we have to. We have been defeated, bottom line. And of course, they will be carried off into captivity. Not all, but most. Obviously, technically, if you're an orphan, you don't have a mother, but these are just ways in which the author here, Jeremiah, is describing the fate of the people, what has had taken place. So they're like orphans. Our mothers are like widows. And again, we have to pay for our drinking water. Our wood comes to us at a price. Next two verses, 5 and 6. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are worn out. We are given no rest. We have submitted to Egypt and Assyria to get enough bread. So paying for drinking water, paying for wood, submitting to Egypt and Assyria. It's just the devastation here is without parallel. I do want to note the word for Egypt. It's Mitzrayim in the Hebrew, and that's considered probably a transliteration. In other words, some of the other languages names for Egypt had the MTSR letters in there, or at least those sounds, and so we have Mitzrayim as the name, but that is actually the name of a human being as well. So after the flood, of course, there were just three that people came from, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And the sons of Ham, Cush, Mitzrayim, Egypt, Put, and Canaan. And so right there in Genesis 10:6, after the flood, we have listed for us the sons of Ham. and Egypt is one of them. And the land of Ham is used in parallel with Egypt, even in Psalm 105:23. This is just an incredible example of straightforward parallelism. Israel's paralleled with Jacob, of course, one and the same person. Came to, sojourned in, and then parallel the last little bit of each verse, Egypt or each line, and that is the land of Ham. So we have, then Israel came to Egypt, Jacob sojourned in the land of Ham, saying exactly the same thing in parallel in that verse, Psalm 105:23. All right, let's move to verse 7 of our text for today, Lamentations 5. Our fathers sinned and are gone. It is we who have been burdened with the punishment for their wrongdoings. All right, so you look at the um, bottom of this text. I do want to point out that the New American Standard, again, always does a good job of letting us know what words are not there. Literally, this would just be fathers, our fathers, sinned, are gone. We, their iniquities, bear. I mean, that's literally all there is in the Hebrew text. So I do want to take a moment, since chapter 5 is shorter and we have more time, I want to note something that maybe you've seen if you've looked at the bottom of the screen at all. And of course, you don't have to for this study. But at the bottom of the screen, sometimes you'll see what we see here. Look at the very bottom, not the white part, but the very bottom, you'll see that there's the first word on the right. Let me get my cursor over here. The first word on the right, then the second word, and then there's a word in quotes and a word in double quotes, and then another word in quotes and another word in double quotes. And then you have the last two words of the sentence. And if you note these two, the single quotes and the double quotes, they're very, very similar. The only difference is this letter in the front. The Vav is what it is, the letter Vav. And then with these two, the only difference is another Vav, another letter Vav. Well, up in the white, where you see the 7 for verse 7, this version of the text does it a different way. Instead of putting the quotes, this version puts a K and then a Q, then a K, then a Q. And so what this is doing, this is showing that where the K is, that stands for Ketiv, and that's what is written. So this is what was in the original Hebrew text. The Q stands for Kari, which is what is to be read. And so even today, if you were in a Jewish synagogue, a worship, or just any event where this passage was being read, they would not say both words. They would just read the Q words, but they would note, the ones reading would note in their minds, they would see, well, this was what was written, but this is what I am to read aloud. This is what, and it's just the addition of the word and. In this case, it's that simple. It's just the ands. And so we go back to our text, and we have our fathers sinned and are gone. We their iniquities bear. And so just adding in the ands, our fathers sinned and are gone. We we their iniquities, and we their iniquities bear. And so in this case, it's not much of a big deal at all. But what is to be read has the Q, the Kari. And obviously the ands make it more readable and more smooth in the reading. And then in another version of the Hebrew text, this is considered the official reading, and this shows what the actual Masoretes put in the margins. And so this is the same verse. You can see the first two words are exactly the same, and the last two words are exactly the same. In this case, though, they put the little circles up above the words where there's a kativ and a kari that are different. So right here we have the actual text of the Hebrew Bible. They didn't want to add anything inappropriately to the actual word. But what should be read, this is the Q in Hebrew, the Kari, is this with that little vav again in front, the and, but this is how this shows that. And then this shows some of the different manuscripts where these differences are found. And one more thing here, just in case you're interested. So the A's, there's a note concerning this whole idea of what is to be read as opposed to what is written. And what it shows here is that this section between the A's up here, this is at the bottom of the page, and it was on two different lines, but I pasted it together. This just means multiple manuscripts have it this way, including the S here. It's an old Roman S, but the S here stands for the Syriac Peshitta. The T stands for the Jewish Targums. The V is the Latin Vulgate, and then this is just Latin for as well as, and then this is the Kari. This is what is to be read. So this Q corresponds with the Q down here. So this is what should be read, and both of them have the Vav in the front. And just pointing out, this is what should be read according to these manuscripts as well. So there's just tons of information available to someone who wants to do deep dives into the Hebrew text and what was handed down throughout the years. The Masoretes did just an amazing job of preserving the the Old Testament, the text of the Bible. And even though they know that you should want to read with those vowels, with the ands in there, they still show what was originally written. They don't want to mess with that. I should point out one more thing here. Notice the what was written. There are none of these marks, none of these vowel markings or accents, because what was written originally had none of that. It was just the consonants in the original. So this version I really like, because you notice all these others. Well, not here, not here. Up here in the margin, they did not have the. Well, no, that's the Kari. That's what's to be read. So what was original, they have the vowel pointings here, but here they don't, and I think that's kind of cool. I think that's kind of neat. So I like this particular way of doing it. It all ends up being the same, but I like this method probably the best if I were to pick. All right. So just a little side note for you all, but just to know that there are so many people out there in the world who have done deep dives into all this. It just gives us even more confidence when we read the New American Standard or the English Standard or even the New International Version, the Christian Standard Bible, all these versions, that so much work has gone into it. So if you just read a few various English versions, you're going to get the sense of the text, at least as we, big giant we, as biblical people recognize the text to be. I mean, there's no doubt that our translations are absolutely incredible, and you can have total confidence in what you are reading. Even if there are slight variations, like last week or the week before, sapphire versus the other blue precious stone that was listed. Okay, well that's yeah, there's a little differences there in how people interpret that, but you know what? If you read both of those versions and maybe a few others, you're going to get a feel for it. There was an important, you know, they used to be like this, and now they're brittle, like rotten wood, as opposed to being like this gemstone. You're going to get the idea of the text. All right, let's look at verses 8 and 9. Continuing on in Lamentations chapter 5. Slaves rule over us. There is no one to rescue us from their hand. We get our bread at the risk of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. The people are desperate. This is a terrible, terrible situation. It's still nothing compared to eternal destruction. Nothing compared to being separated from God and his blessings for eternity. So even this is a picture for us. Stay faithful to the Lord. All right. And then verses 10 and 11. Our skin has become as hot as an oven because of the ravages of hunger. They violated the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. And what a terrible note to end on for today. The idea of being famished, the idea of being hungry to the point of burning, and of course, the sexual violation of the women. And again, this is a parallel statement. They violated the women in Zion, the virgins in the cities of Judah. Just the all encompassing, terrible events that happened to the women and, of course, to the whole of the population. Absolutely devastating, that's for sure. All right, let's read the whole text in the ESV. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Look and see our disgrace. Our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to foreigners. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay for the water we drink. The wood we get must be bought. Our pursuers are at our necks. We are weary. We are given no rest. We have given the hand to Egypt and to Assyria to get bread enough. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Slaves rule over us. There is none to deliver us from their hand. We get our bread at the peril of our lives because of the sword in the wilderness. Our skin is hot as an oven with the burning heat of famine. Women are raped in Zion, young women in the towns of Judah. Oh, it's just so devastating, so awful. All right. As I promised, we will look at the rest of chapter 4 of Second Corinthians as we close out, and definitely a little better way to end a class than verse 11 of Lamentations chapter 5. This passage points out really how blessed we are in Christ. And because we have salvation, because we have the Spirit, because we have Christ, bad things will happen to us too. Nothing like what was happening, hopefully, nothing like was happening in Jerusalem in the time of Jeremiah, but we will not be destroyed, is the promise, because of what we have within. All right, 2 Corinthians 4, starting in 7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh. So death is at work in us, but life in you. Since we have the same spirit of faith according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke, we also believe, and so we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will raise us also with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. All right, next week we will look at Lamentations 5:12 to 22. The plea then is restore us to yourself. May the Lord bless us and keep us as we keep on studying his great word.